Good afternoon, Brian.
How are you doing today, sir?
I'm well, thank you. It's moving quickly through spring here in Philadelphia and starting to feel like summer. I think I might have heard a mosquito buzzing
Oh, wow.
at some point today,
Yeah,
but
we're
we'll see.
sunny, but still a little chilly. The wind is out, so
Yeah,
still a little
it's hanging
chilly.
around. Yeah. Well, we'll see. I mean, I got really used to not having to worry about mosquitoes in New Mexico.
Oh,
Although
yeah.
the gnats on the mesa were really awful the last couple summers. So, you
We've
know.
had some mosquitoes. I've not yet, but I started getting those donuts you put in your stock tanks,
Oh, yeah.
and they have some critter in there that gets the
Instead
mosquito.
of putting a fish in there, I remember once you were putting goldfish in your stock tank.
Yeah, I could have this year. I kept enough water.
Yeah.
Uh, no, that's actually a good way. If you get the light to reflect the on the surface of the water, boy, every kind of critter crash lands in there, and the fish just like a smorgasbord all day. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So I have a coaching client that I've kind of been having an interesting development with that I thought we would expound on and maybe our audience would like it too. So so this person was kind of struggling with what I think the way we're talking about it is their self-critical voice and self-critical nature is dummying up their creative expression.
Uh,
And the strategy that they first came up with to get after that was what they called playing offense, which I interpreted through our conversations as kind of regardless of what these voices are saying, powering through and making a creative expression happen despite. And so they tried that for a week and basically came back and said, the critical voices were stronger than ever. Maybe also more apparent because there was more of an awareness of them.
mhm.
But there weren't a lot of experiences of successfully manifesting creative expression. There were like it was more like banging a head against the wall. And so the strategy they came up with next was dropping the word offense and just playing. And I've got a baby who's just about 100 days old, and I'm watching like the play instinct emerge.
Mhm.
And I see how driven he is to crawl and make eye contact and laugh and grab stuff and put it in his mouth. And this drive is innate, right? It's an a priori intuition to develop some skills here because I'm not encouraging him specifically in any of those ways.
Husserl, this is Husserl's intentionality,
Uh
that
huh.
we aren't passive and we don't just have all these things just happen to us. Consciousness reaches out, and that is that first expression of intentionality. And yeah, you see it in the baby. And people want to say, "Oh, it's just instinct. It's just instinct." No, because
I
there's
would drop the
mind
just.
behind it in a different way. So it's the first chapter of a different story. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, let's include that. But the main topic that I wanted to offer up is what about play?
Yeah.
And when I divorced, I did some play therapy with my kids and learned that play is a tremendously valuable way for kids to process material,
Mhm.
internal material, and integrate it even. And parents participating in play with the kids can help the kids integrate material if
Mhm.
parents participate smartly.
Yep.
Um, but when's the last time you played, or maybe you're playing right now, or how do you think about it?
What I heard, when you said take the offensive away and think about playing, it feels closer. And the reason is because, I identify to that as an artist. And when amateur artists, when artists are beginning and they're not trained yet, or they don't understand the steepness and the height of the mountain maybe that they need to climb, They start out and they're very attached. They're like, "Here's my painting, here's my painting. Look, and this and that and this and that and this and that." Successful professional artists aren't so much like that. They're a lot more like, and it's all, like, and what it means is that what playing the other side of playing is non-attachment, right? And so that means that I'm not attached to this piece that I just put out because the next piece is on its way and the next piece is on its way. And I'm focused not on the product, I'm focused on the process. So playing is discovery. Playing is non-attachment to results, action without lust for result. And that's what shuts up that self-censoring voice. You're attached to the results, and that's not play, right? By definition. I mean, even though, yeah, we play baseball, we want to hit the ball and we want to get around the bases and everything, but still, you won the game, you lost the game, you go home, you have supper, it's all the same, right? It's play. And so that would be my feeling. And, the other thing that leaps to mind is that censoring voice relates to what Freud used to call the superconscious. And I don't know off the top of my head the word that he used in German. There's probably something would be revealed if we dig that out. But that's like the voice. Okay, I had one. Here's a personal story. I can remember being a teenager back in the day in the 70s, 19, not 18. And I was playing music loud, and my father was, he would commute. And so he was pretty predictable how long it took him before he would show back up in the house. And for some reason that escapes me, he showed up early and I had the music up way loud. Now, I didn't have it wasn't like I had, naked girls dancing or a cloud of marijuana smoke or that like there was the music was just a bit loud, right? And I got a shitstorm that just would blow your mind just about this, deal, right? And so, but I'm a teenager, so it's like, oh, fuck you, whatever. And but years later, when I'm in my own place and I would turn up the music, I would actually hear in my head some version of that voice freaking out, right? So I try to turn the music up a little more when I hear that voice, right? But what I'm pointing to is that self-censoring, and it got we've talked before that all our voices are not our own. All the voices in our head are not our own. And the way you spoke that, it seemed like they were on to that. Like they knew this is an influence. I can separate myself from that perspective. Right. So that's already the right direction. But to understand that it's kind of a download, and you might even be able to spelunk back and see whose voice that really is that's echoing in your head, But regardless of whose voice and regardless of why it's there, as an artist, you must set yourself free. As a creator, you must set yourself free to allow yourself to see what can come out before you start to censure it. Right. Now you're gonna pick your best stuff, and later you're gonna go back and you say, "Okay, well, that one's a little too green, or that one's a little too dark, or this should be a little bigger." Of course, there's always that stuff, but that's post facto, right? That doesn't interrupt the creative process. I might have mentioned before that back in the day, the lady who they were saying had the highest IQ. They asked her what makes people stupid, and she said, letting the thought, "I'm not getting it," take root. Well, the reason that we don't want that thought, "I'm not getting it," to start listening to that is because it interrupts the process of getting it. And this is the same sort of thing. And it seems like they're aware of that because they know this voice not helping. right? Uh, Now there are voices that do help. I was a goldsmith and I had to have a little voice in there that said, "No, that's not good enough. You need to get that cleaner. You need to get that shinier. You need to." So that's it's not that that's not part of the part of the creative process, but what we're talking here is not a technical thing. This is more of a psycho-emotional thing, right? And so, yeah, that voice just has to sit in the right seat. So we need the usher to wake up and do his job here internally and just say, "Okay, this sits over there in the cheap seats, and we'll when I want something out of you, I'll come and get it." You know, and that and but the voices of my teachers, "What are you doing?" Right? Or uh those are there, and one has to have a certain relationship with them. If you do it right, they'll work for you. But if you do it wrong, they'll just beat you up. If you don't have the right relationship, that's what I mean by doing it wrong. So that's kind of what comes up to me. And often what it means is you just need to do a bunch of it more. And, think as an artist, you'd say, okay, my first 100 pieces are going to be throwaways. You know, I think I told that with Quana, right? So now he's on guitar number. He just sent me a picture of his latest. Uh, he's in 30 or 40 in. And I probably told him 100. Right? Well, I lied because he's damn good already at 40. But
The guitar
emotionally
might be different than something else.
but emotionally, he needed to set himself up for 100.
Yeah.
And so, that's why it's a good thing that sometimes potters will do this. They'll throw a pot, they'll make it perfect, and then they'll just lump it up and do it again. And, there is that's shifting also to the process from the product. What am I really doing here? And this is the pay dirt, right? You've been engaged in a creative process. It's revealed what's going on internally and your self-management things. And now you realize for that external process to be right, I need the usher to put everything in the right seats, and then I'm good to go. So what was the work? Was it the outside thing or was it the inner work? Right. So you could actually say, wow, I am seeing these voices now. I'm really covering ground now. Like, now I'm really getting traction because I'm seeing the obstacles. I know that's kind of a flip, but that's really honestly from my seat and from having seen people grow through the creative process, that's what I would see. And that would be the model I would probably suggest.
I think it's I think you probably had this experience too of things are too easy, and then you experience some conflict and you think, oh, now we're getting into it. Now something useful is happening, something productive. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I want to come back to play a little bit more. I think
Mhm.
the question of these censuring voices is a good one, and there might be more to mine there too. But when it comes to play, right, we it seems like the role of play in our adult lives is greatly curtailed compared to when we're children. And in a way that makes sense because the amount we have to learn, and maybe in particular, maybe let me know what you think about this. Maybe we're learning so much culture stuff, and play is especially important for integrating culture stuff like values and morality and ethics, and like what how do we treat one another certainly gets expressed through play by children as maybe the biggest theme. I don't know, I'm not a psychologist. But yeah, it seems like we don't do it a whole lot, or if we do it, it's in subtle ways. But it seems like the payoff could be amazing if we did it more.
Right, right. I mean, I think when you first started to say that, and you said we don't play much, the voice in my head said, and we don't learn as much either when we stop playing. And those are not just arbitrarily associated. You know, I have three little ones that are playing wolf all the time, And you can see that they're compelled to exercise that capacity, and play is obsession. And it's also never for keeps, right? So it has that nobody's throat gets ripped out, right? But it is like trying on the results. What would it be like if? And children do that. You're going to be the dad, and I'm going to be the mom, and which is a sort of that trying on and seeing how things, which is all it's related to the basic human function, right? Of trying to predict the future. This is where we have an intimate relationship with a sensibility around causality. Because if we don't have a grasp of causality, we can't cast into the future. And play is a very elaborate, multidimensional way to run those experiments. And I think dreams might sit one or two lanes nearby that, and that it is part of the higher functions is where we start the higher animals is where we start seeing play. Like, we can't really perceive in an amoeba, particularly a playtime. They seem to pretty much amoeba along on an even keel. But as these higher functions that have to go through a more rigorous developmental process to work, that's where it seems like play starts to creep in, where we need to run these circuits. uh, you know, what it relates to in my head is, when we have the strategy deck, one of the cards in the strategy deck is called the practice field. And the idea of a practice field is taken. Oh, go ahead.
I'm not sure our audience knows anything about the strategy deck. Do you want to introduce that a little more?
Oh, well, I think, years ago, I was introduced to Brian Eno's oblique strategy deck, which is an app now you can download on YouTube or on Play School or whatever they call that. Uh, you know where to get your stuff, and it's free. So it's fun, and it's for artists, and it's about oblique strategies. And it was originally a deck so that you could shuffle it and you pull out one, and it gives you an idea, a new angle to consider. And so I thought, well, it's interesting because why not a non-oblique strategy deck? And what would that look like? Because I'd had all these downloads from all these different teachers, and and some of these were very nuggetized. And like we spoke with Jeffrey, using metaphor, we can take that nugget and we can see if that metaphor fits any of these other situations. And if it does, then the piece of information that goes with that metaphor might apply also in this other situation. That is, the content, the signal in that the payload of that metaphor might be useful in that new situation. So that's what a practice field is. And maybe it doesn't show up as play, but flower arranging, ikebana, there are certain principles, and there's certain, when there is a working out, there's a thing you're kind of after, and there's a chance to do that. But like we mentioned, you are part of that. So your sensibilities are refined, and you get a chance to look at yourself and the way that you do things. For example, in Ikebana, this is my little bonsai sneers, you always cut on the exhale. You never cut on the inhale. Well, why does it matter? The plant doesn't know whether you were sucking in or blowing out when you cut it, because it's not just about the product. It's about the process. It's about, right? Zen archery is one of those play areas, practice fields. But the thing that we get from it, we're meant to take out everywhere. When I was young, I left Peter's school where I had been for several years, and I got into, all these different situations, as one does. And I would watch myself deal with it in a certain way and almost kind of surprise myself. Like, wow, that didn't ruffle me like it ruffled everybody else. What's going on with that? And I actually went back. I came to the conclusion that Peter had really been teaching me Zen. After I sat with a Zen master, and then I, kind of traced back these things. And I went back and I watched him for any signs of ulterior motive. not there at all. He was just doing the deal, and it was in the deal that all that stuff came out, so to speak. And so that's the value of a practice field, and that might be something also that might be useful for your client, is to find areas to specifically not be perfectionist about, that represent, for example, in Zen archery, we're not we're not trying to shoot with the same internal condition that, say, a Western archer might be. There's this idea that the arrow is released like a ripe fruit falls from a tree. And I'm sure the breath is involved, got to be, right? And
Gotta be.
so there is this wholeness to yourself in this process of manifesting this external thing. All the traditional, they're called does, right? So it's iaido if I'm pulling the sword out, right? It's karate do if I'm fighting empty hand. It's judo if I'm doing the gentle stuff. And that do translates as a way. It's not just a way to arrange flowers or a way to shoot an arrow. It's a way to the realization that Zen talks about, and that's why they're called. It's Zen. In fact, there's a book I'll put in the show notes called Zen and the Ways, or Zen and its Ways, and it talks about that relation. And a lot of things are revealed that way, and we work them out in effigy, and then we find out that we've onboarded that capacity to apply it improv. You know, so there might be something to that. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, and as you're giving examples of play through the practice field idea, it occurs to me that we have a lot of different meanings of play or expressions of play. Um, so there's kind of like on this podcast, we're playing with ideas in a very real sense. We're unscripted. We're kind of like letting these things come up, and we're batting them around to see what they do and how they work together and how we think about them today as opposed to a different day. And
mhm,
um, do they, you know, do they help us interpret this situation or not? Or so, and then we're also playing with the idea of this medium as a vehicle for the transmission of, let's say, these kinds of frameworks or strategies that we've colloquialized and think others might benefit from having. So there's play happening here,
mhm.
um, but it doesn't have the kind of rigor. Well, I don't think it does of like a Zen archery. Um, maybe it could. And then there's also ways that we play that are even less formal than what we're doing on the podcast, right?
Sure.
Maybe formal is not the right word, but structured.
Uh-huh.
And maybe those serve different purposes, even.
Yeah, and I think, like for example, if I think of the kids when they're trying to learn a skateboard trick that they can't do, are they playing? Are they working? Are they practicing? Are they experimenting? All of those kind of live very close to each other, and but they imply different voices manifesting in the head, right? Because we dress those up differently in our heads, and uh, a lot of times, one of the things that we didn't get to talk with Jeff about that I did want to point out because I thought it was so important, but there was so much good stuff there, was he said that you should be focused 80% on asking questions and getting information and 20% on providing the solution. And that we tend to do that in an opposite way. So that 80%, that asking questions, that's where I would put play into that 80%. I would also maybe call it getting dirty with the thing. Right? Which means sometimes you got to get in there and you don't know, and and I've been a shade tree mechanic, and sometimes you don't know how you're going to get that thing off. And So is it play? Is it work? Is it sailing into the unknown like Captain Kirk? I think so, in part.
Well, I think it describes it's not so much the 80% asking questions as the how of that question asking. Because you could go in there with a list of 30 questions that you rattle off.
Right.
That's not what you're talking about.
No.
Um, there's a there's like a yeah, what you said about practicing and experimenting and all of these different adjacents having interrelationship, I think is where I'm ending up too, because you know there's almost a how you ask the questions that relates to how much intuition are you using and how much rational components are you using and how much emotional components are you using that is doing the internal refinement, like the skateboard trick
Mhm.
improvement, at the same time as learning about the external world, or learning with the external world to um, potentially propose solutions or um, integrate the material surfaced by the questions in some meaningful way.
Sure. And again, it's balancing or managing the relationship with those different voices, right? So for example, when I'm going to a water system and there's an issue, uh, I've I've always got, or if you're trying to make a car run, troubleshooting, there's always a melange of facts that throw themselves at you, right? Okay, the car is blue. Okay, that's probably not a fact that's going to solve the problem of why it won't start. Uh, but what you'll find is that you make two kinds of mistakes. You take a fact and you think it's significant, but it turns out in this case it's not significant. It's not as obvious as the color of the car being what. And then there's the opposite where there's one that you think is significant and it's not, right? So you can miss them and you can hallucinate them when they're not there. And it's always a voice in your head that comes up with this. I
That's a
bet
really
it's the
useful, um, what's the word? I mean, other than philosophical machine, mental model, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. And doctors go through this. I mean, the better
Yeah.
ones. Some sit at a computer and the computer goes through that for them. But it's the same process. And that is it's almost like we talked about with the phenomenologists and them this idea of bracketing. It's like I want to hold off from making conclusions. I want to just get immersed in more data and more data and more data and more data until the answer just leaps out. And if I'm going, is it this or is it that? I need to immerse myself in the pattern more. Like when I was a kid, I used to work as to assist a carrier air conditioning repair business, and I remember and I was just the guy that helped carry stuff from the truck. And I would go with these mechanics that were years mechanics, right? So they had their think method very well established. And we went to one mall and we go into this mall and it's clearly hot in here. This is not supposed to be like something's not, the outcome isn't the desired outcome. And we went through all these places in the mall where the public never gets to go, up into these rooms up in top with these huge machines or big air handlers, and all these things. And we have a set of thermometers and we put these thermometers in different places in the vents to get temperature differentials and every kind of thing. And we go through it and we're at this for hours and nothing is screaming at us, right? But the building's not cold, right? And so it gets to lunchtime. We still don't have any answer. And we're sitting there down in one of the cafes in the restaurant. And we notice the clock on the wall. It's like we got off at lunch or we stopped for lunch at 1 or 1:30. The clock there says it's 11. Huh? Right? Well, that was it right there. It doesn't seem like. Do you get it?
The power had gone out for 2.5 hours.
The power had gone out, and it was probably longer than that. It was probably like 4 or 5 hours.
So the air conditioning was catching up. The other thing I thought it could be is that made you realize that a timer in the air conditioning system was set to PM and should have been set to AM or something like that.
Right, right. Except it had worked perfectly up until then.
Yeah.
So, and we were the only ones that touched the machine. So we go in there and there's the little spin wheel that has the little things you unscrew and it hits the switch when it spins by that turns it on and turns it off. And no air conditioning system is designed to take a building from peak heat of the day to cool. It's definitely you got to start in the morning and build as the day builds, and then you can taper off. And of course these machines are well engineered. But it turns out there was nothing wrong with it. And the solution that was just to turn that dial back up to make it set in the time. And then we drove home. But all the scenarios, right? And you constantly the searching for clues. Well, you just have to keep going until finally some piece of evidence flags this direction to look.
That kind of makes me land on a different topic than play, because I've found this really interesting recently, and I think I experienced it with Jeff Moore in our interview with him also, that there are people who know their business inside out, upside down, left and right, and they say things that seem really simple, and they say them in really simple ways. And I'm thinking of an engineer that I worked with, because your story reminded me of a similar experience I had crawling all over the big community rec center in Santa Fe, trying to figure out why it was using like 3 times as much energy as had been predicted. And turns out there wasn't a single reason for that, but putting the ice rink right next to the gym, or the heated swimming pool, excuse me, and not capturing the waste heat from the ice rink and putting it in the swimming pool is a factor,
I would
and
imagine.
also contributed to some condensation in the basketball gym. That yeah.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
um, but I was crawling all over that project with an engineer, and this engineer that I worked with for a while, he would say things like, um, he was a heating and cooling guy, and he would say really simple things, like he would just remind me that BTUs are dependent on flow. Like, it's not just temperature differential, it's also flow. So you can have a really small temperature differential and a really high flow, and that can deliver just as many BTUs as,
Mhm. Right.
high differential low flow. And um he used to walk around with this little reference that showed how many BTUs could be delivered at a given temperature differential at a given flow rate through a given pipe size, right? And so he would just refer to that all the time, and just really simple.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Like, there weren't that many core tenets that in concert allowed him to do really sophisticated things. And so
Right.
I'm just thinking about that, because of what you brought up, and there's a there's a strategy in that too.
Well, I
In
think that's phronesis.
Say more.
Well, that idea of phronesis is practical knowledge, and it's described as knowing what to do.
Hmm.
And every doing is not generic. Every doing is specific. It's a doing here.
Deterministic.
Pardon?
Deterministic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the outcome might not be, but the
I
event
mean,
has to
it's a
be.
transition from the probable
Yeah.
to to the determined.
Right. And so every doing has to solve the problem of how do I go from general principle to this application, which we've talked about before. We've talked about philosophy, looking at all the specifics and trying to distill out the general. But when we get back to doing, we have to undo that, because now it's this particular case. How do those principles help me apply in this particular case? And that's a more difficult problem. This is what Kant was talking about in the Critique of Pure Reason back, if you really want to mess your head up for a few weeks. But that's basically part of what the issue is. How do we do that effectively in a probabilistic, possibilistic universe, right? And yeah, that doing, what do we do is the core of Phronesis, and it's got moral aspects to it, but it's also got prudence aspects. And according to Aristotle, this is of course one of his terms, you can't get it from a book. It's not the product of reason, it's the product of experience. So the best way is to learn it from someone that has the experience, and that's why apprenticeships are so powerful, mentorships are so powerful. um, you want to find where your leak is. Well, an old clever water operator will show you how to use the big pipe wrench and how to manipulate the valves so that you can hear the slight singing of a leak if it's big enough. But you might have to do it at 3 a.m. because that's the only time other things won't be. So there's tricks to these things that I know I learned the hard way. And in some cases, I could have been filled in, but the choice was made not to tell me. Let's put it that way. um,
Choices were made,
choices were made.
presumably for your benefit.
Yeah, not so much. This
And yet
was
you benefited.
I benefited, yeah, but it was kind of a setup. It was, I think, that to make the job look harder than it really was, would enhance the 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 reputation of people who'd done it before if I was to screw it up a bit beforehand. But I foiled that plot. And but anyway, there is something, and that's one of the things also that relates back to the very first question. And how do you handle those voices? Well, part of that is what I like to call time body. And time body, like the way that I always think of it, is in a martial encounter, when I'm standing in front of my opponent, I'm not just standing there. I'm standing there with all of my years of experience, that cognitive model that's been built up from all my exposure and all my practicing and all of those things. So all of my years of experience are standing there with me. So in that respect, now at 65 years old, compared to when I was young, I have an enormous time body. So I'm able to stand in front of an opponent and just go, "What?" Which is that non-judgmental, open, flood me with information
It's
so
really a
that
playful question.
and it's like open to possibilities,
Right,
right? And I would
right.
argue that it's probably more right brain than left brain would be my guess. But when you're beginning, you don't have that kind of chops. When you're beginning, your internal dialogue is a lot more like, oh lordy, what's going to happen now? Is he going to do this? If he does that, maybe I'll try to do that. And if he does this instead, then would that work? Or maybe I'll do this other thing. And there's just this chatter. So with time body, with having gotten that experience, with really being able to rest in knowing what to do, all those voices, you know, they can just go entertain themselves, right? Because my attention is no longer vulnerable to that. Same thing with a woodworker, or any skill set. And I pointed this out with Quan and his guitars. It isn't that you're a master because now every time you do it perfectly. That's not a thing in real life. You're a master because you kind of know the things that tend to happen, and you can take the precautions you need to prevent them from happening. But sometimes shit happens. And when it does, you know what to do. Now you've got phronesis, but you don't start there. You don't ever start there. Second guessing is part of that beginning phase. So how do you get past that? You get your first 100 in, and somewhere along there, you will have stopped thinking about it because you're so engaged in the process, not the product, the process, that you'll go, "Oh, I don't I guess I'm not in my own way the way that I used to be." Somewhere the I got pulled out of myself and into the process.
That so let's go back to how we deal with our critical inner voices in real time, because you've kind of tossed out a few different models for that, and I think a little more taxonomy would be useful. So earlier you said something about needing an usher to direct that voice to the correct seat in the auditorium, and that if you need something from that voice, you will let them know. And
Mhm,
that's not a light-handed comment. There might be times when you do actually need something from that voice.
mhm, yeah.
So so I think where I'm going is we have a tendency to try to critical away the self-critical voice. We try to suppress it, we try to tell it to go away and leave us alone. Be
Dummy it up.
we try a lot of things that constitute being in conflict with it, and in my experience that doesn't really work. We need ways to integrate it. And so there's like the acceptance or the awareness acceptance action loop that they teach in 12 step, or in IFS, right, the internal family system of therapy. You identify which of your internal selves or archetypes this voice represents and try to find out what that person or archetype really needs and fulfill those needs,
Uh-huh.
or have some negotiation with the internal person that voice represents. um,
Which is a
what else you got?
process, which is a process. And that's kind of what I'm saying is that we work that out in process. The way that I think of it is like the conductor of the orchestra. And that critical mind is like that oboe player that just will not observe the rests. You don't play every theme in the symphony. I will point to you when the part that's written on your page comes up. And until then, I don't want to be hearing out of you. Right. And uh, but still, until you've played that piece of music, I'm not sure a bunch. I'm not sure the oboe player ever listens. But yeah, I mean, like, he's gotta
The
go through a
proverbial
repetition.
oboe player.
Yeah, but we don't wanna kick him out of the symphony because
We're not
there
talking
are
about any
parts
specific oboe player, just to make sure.
we're never gonna get Peter and the Wolf together if we don't have the oboe player, right? But he can't keep trying to play the timpani parts, right? So so there's something about things internally being well organized. And I think that just happens with time. The old expression, I think we mentioned this before, to have sand in your belly, whether it was from the cowboy or the sailors.
Right.
What it did was it gave mass so that you're not blown off course quite as easily, right? And yeah, you just get that through cowboy and up, and I think sort of realizing that it isn't a problem. It's just an imbalance that you grow through and you'll get out of, and everybody does versions of, faces versions of that. So don't stigmatize it. The fact that it's on the screen means it's in the process of working out. And not everything that's going on inside of us is obvious to our ego attention. Some of it is just a learning process that we're going through, and it's inevitable. And
This client is coming up on his midlife transition also.
okay. Mhm.
So I take it as a really great sign that these voices are apparent to him and ready to be integrated, and
Yeah.
that his creative will is really trying to manifest
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
through that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like a fruitful time, and that's why, I would say initially it seems like a sign of the process, and so I do think that there are we do have these psychic processes that have their own intelligence, and they sort of time release, and some of it is stuff when you finally got enough distance from it. So, for me, it was around midlife when before that, if you had asked me if there was an influence in that area, I would have said, no, there's no influence from whatever this past event, none whatsoever. And look how functional I am, and da 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 da. And then after that transition, I could see that in fact the influence was so pervasive, it was everywhere. And that's why I couldn't see it, because like a fish
You're
can't see
up to
water.
here, yeah.
Yeah. And that now there's a kind of an aha that comes when you allow that to integrate. But
Yeah,
there is an allowance component to it. It isn't all just realization. That's why I think I mentioned before that Freud went into resistance therapy, trying to see what's the thing that's being protected, because that's
yeah.
the core of the issue. Well, sometimes it takes the personality getting a distance from the cause of that thing before the resistance can dial down enough for natural processes to work through it.
That might be a cause and effect, or there might I liked the phrase time release that you used a little while ago, because sometimes we need distance, but sometimes this is just a developmental
Yeah, yeah,
process that takes its own time.
sure.
Like we're more than willing to deal with it, but it just won't reveal itself until we yeah.
And
Um,
sometimes it's because there's a lot on our plate. When you're getting chased by the bear, you're not worried about subtler issues that
yeah.
might show up over time. But as soon as the bear's dealt with, now it's time to think about getting something to eat
Yeah, or
or
as Jeff said, once you realize you're playing in the second half, that changes motivations too.
and attachments. Yeah.
So we use the word integrate a lot, and I realized that's one of those words that could mean something different to everybody who says it and everybody who hears it. So let's close this episode out talking about the word integrate. And what did you mean when you said, um, that the past experience was ready to be integrated?
Ah. Um, well, I think for me, it was, part of our cognitive model is related to how we understand ourselves. And we have a picture of who we see ourselves to be. We also have a picture, maybe, of who we want to be seen as. And those are not typically the same. Uh, we might have an intuition for who we are to be, which is that a priori sense around identity, and which we kicked around with Jeff a bit. Um, but I think that when we're young, we're tight around these issues. We hold them with whiter knuckles because it our survival seems more dependent on them or how we are about them or something. And so then as we deepen and as our sense of ourselves deepens, we can integrate more difficult things and we can have little ahas around it uh, that maybe if we had been exposed to them before, we would have rejected the idea out of hand, or it just would have seemed like complete left field. Or but then you go through and then you kind of see maybe how, oh, those that does add up. I can now see those little patterns, and now I can maybe accept that about myself, even though I might not know entirely what it means.
Hmm.
you know like for me, what does it mean to be born an orphan? And not just what does it mean in the outcomes, but what does it mean on the level of mind and experience, that what's the message of that? And so the integrating of that is part of wrestling with understanding that. Not that you ever understand it. You maybe just come to peace with it. That might be what it really amounts to. It's to you cut yourself you cut yourself more slack because you realize the components that you brought and the ones that were circumstantial and put upon you. And that's also part of those voices, which voices are motivating you, and the voice of that Uber Ich that you mind out there. Yes, the over I.
Yeah. So maybe let me propose a definition, and then you can tune it up. So I think when I say integrate, and I think this is aligned with what you were just sharing, I think there maybe are two important elements. One is that the internal thing becomes conscious, so we're in relationship with it, and then that the relationship with it is uh, friendly or peaceful. And I think
We
you
have to be
said
okay
you're
with
at
it.
peace with it. Yeah.
We have to be okay with it, and then maybe there's two levels to that. We probably have to be okay with it on some level, even to see it, to have it rise up uh, into
Right.
consciousness.
Yeah.
And then once we get it, we have to be okay with it to bring it in as a part of our story, as a part of ourselves, and to understand that it is a part of ourselves and that
Integrate
it's
into the
okay.
self. Integrate into the self is an important element
Yeah,
there that I wasn't being explicit about.
yeah.
But right, we allow this thing to be part of the whole that we are, instead of trying to let it drive or be in resistance to it, or whatever the alternatives might be.
Or being hung up on a meaning that's been front loaded along with that. So yeah, so there's a lot to that, and that is still part of that individuation process. We're sniffing a lot around Carl Jung's territory here, and this idea of the shadow, and the shadow being something that we reject, but then we have to bring in to have a holistic existence. And so understanding that, and it being okay that that's the way it is, and somehow using that as a starting place to work from. And because we're all in that Heideggerian thrownness. And so, for Heidegger, we needed to have the right relationship with ourselves to come into authenticity. That was that idea. And coming to terms with our being. And, that was one of his workhorse terms. So it gets into the title. And being in time, right? Because time, turns out we can't separate it from being, because being is about existing through time. And that's what we're talking about, is our being now existing through time and authenticating itself by becoming whole. And the integration is built on that intuition of coherence, right? To cohere, to stick together, that all the pieces fit each other, each piece in its place, and each place with its piece. And so that but we don't start there. That is the process. And I would argue that's where we're going with Aristotle when we're looking for eudaimonia, right? That's
That's
when
the telos.
that's the eudaimonia is the good life, or good spirit, good fortune, good,
But you're
correct
saying
unfolding.
we're on a trajectory towards coherence.
Yeah, yeah, to higher levels of coherence. And that,
Yeah.
we could push that and say that the more coherence I have manifested internally, or I guess you don't manifest it internally, you I've assembled internally, attained
Experience.
internally, starts to manifest as coherence in my outer existence. And we talked about that with the when the master is in on the inside, then he doesn't show up on the outside. What's an example of that? It working for yourself. If you're the kind of person that can't hold your own feet to the fire, then you need a boss to do it for you. And then he's going to take a piece of the action. But if you actually can manifest the boss or internalize the boss, then you get him out of the formula in the outside world, and that's that same idea. So that there's a resonance from between the inside and the outside. Um, so it sounds to me like that's sort of what your client is working on, is getting that resonance between the inside and the outside to kind of, and seeing that, gee, there's things there that maybe need to get worked on, but they're just tunings. They're not like broken bones,
Yeah.
right? They're just imbalances. And these are things that life does tune us as we go, as long as we're open to it. You got to bring that. You got to be
Yeah.
willing to see what you see. You know, you got to be able to handle the truth, as Jack Nicholson would say.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and maybe this is where we also get into a kind of a metaphysics because uh, if you understand that you are part of, Jeff used the same example of entelechy that everybody uses, that I've used, which is the acorn turning into the oak tree. Well, so what's hidden in the idea of the acorn turning into the oak tree is all the acorns turning into the forest, which turns into the perpetuation of the forest, right? So we might have a metaphysic that tells us that we're not part of the forest, that an acorn doesn't even necessarily, maybe it's just squirrel food, like that that it's all accident somehow. And yeah, accident is a component of it, because without that there would be no novelty, right? It would all be a book that we'd all already read already. And life is not that. There has to be novelty, right? Um, so, but anyway, yeah, if you feel like you're disconnected and there's no part of the strategy, then maybe you feel like everything that's not perfect yet is your fault. And there might be people all around you that want to pathologize these processes for cash and prizes. And that's why I always am trying to say that, this is all part of a natural process. This is the no experts are needed for the acorn to turn into the oak tree. It's a natural process, but he may have to grow around some logs on the ground, and it may have to, handle some chewing here and there from various creatures, but it's still within it to fulfill itself as an oak tree. And that's the idea of the forest, is to have the oak trees. Right. So you're nested inside of these things, and so is that agenda of growth. And so we can actually trust that a little bit, And yes, sometimes things go wrong, but in general, that's not the case. In general, things unfold, you know,
Mm.
and that's where that midwifery idea comes in. This is a natural process. Doesn't mean it can't be dramatic at times. Might be really messy, but this is a process that has a birth at the end of it, so like that.
Mm. We might have to do an episode on that.
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot there, and trusting the process. When we talked about Giordano Bruno, the universe is a place out of which you cannot fall. We're sort of translating that maybe more metaphorically than he intended it, but that idea there is sort of like that's where the license comes from, to for it to be okay to let those voices kind of just chatter away, keep going. You have to really get that it's okay. And then you don't need that attachment to any of these outcomes, and then watch if the attachment doesn't come, because you've had that switch to bestow now, because it's not about the attachment, it's about bestowing, which is exactly non-attachment, right? So yeah, I mean, if an artist thinks of their work as a gift or a prayer, to the universe, then uh, you can do a beautiful painting and have no attachment to it whatsoever afterwards, you know. Or, I worked for one goldsmith, and the guy that taught me goldsmithing, and he brought a piece to a gallery in Santa Fe. And the guy gallery owners are a particular type of psychology. We could write a big, fat, ugly book about that. But so
Probably a short, ugly book.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe. But so he brings him these pair of earrings that he'd spent a lot of time on. They were quite unique. And the guy goes, "Yeah, oh, okay, thanks." And he puts them in the drawer and uh now this guy was a great artist as far as the expertise part, but he was still on the young side. And when he saw how that guy didn't actually look at them and appreciate them and sort of feed him back some of what he wanted from that, he's like, "Okay, give me those things back. We're not going to play. If you're not going to treat my creation with respect, then I'm I'm not going to play." Right? And he was in a position where he could do that, right? But as a beginning artist, you can't. You can't think that your work has inherent value until you've made hundreds of them. And not that it doesn't have value, but you can't afford to think that it does, or you'll start circling that instead of expanding out, right? You got to see what's next. You have to be more compelled about what's next than censuring yourself about what's happening in front of you now. So you kind of go, maybe the idea is after that much time, you realize that you're not really the creative source, that this process is the creative thing. And so you just need to like not get in the way of it. And so you're not going to take as much credit or attach to it. Like, this is me. It's like, no, it's not really me. It's really just the creative forces of the universe that are using me as an outlet. So I can't get all crazy with it and be pumping myself up because I mean, you can do that. It's just
Or beating
stupid,
myself
right?
up. Either way, right? It
It's the
cuts both
same. It's
ways.
the same, right?
Yeah.
It's attachment,
Yeah.
right? So I would be looking at what's the root of that attachment? Are you if you're still trying to feed your ego, then middle life is a very hard chapter. So there's a reason your body's changing. There's a reason that life doesn't show up the same way as it did when you're 20. And being 50 isn't just doing 20 really, really, really well. You know,
Nor really slowly.
yeah, right. It's a whole other thing, right? It really is a whole other thing. And that's one of the big takeaways from Jeff Moore. And that is that know the chapter you're in and be using the right frameworks and value systems and thinking methods that are chapter appropriate to that chapter. You can't think chapter 1 when you're in chapter 5. And that means that when you turn that page between chapters, you have to adapt to that change. And that's tricky. I'll give it to you. It's tricky. But without that, we're not going anywhere, right? We're all 20-year-olds forever. So God save us from that.
Cool. Um,
Very well.
I think let's leave it there, and I think we'll come back to a couple of these topics maybe next time. So yeah, thank you, Brian, for the great conversation, and I will see you soon.
Sounds good, sir. See you next time around.